Hello, bruvs. We're back with the 7 deadly sins. I was going to go with woman under socialism, but the first chapter is rather long, and the print is even ridiculously small. So we'll move on to the 7 deadly sins, knock off another chapter closer to the end. Sloth. Rather short chapter, as the next one is as well. Sloth by Evelyn Waugh. The word sloth is seldom on modern lips. When used, it is a mildly facetious variant of indolence, and indolence, surely, so far from being a deadly sin, is one of the most amiable of weaknesses. Most of the world's troubles seem to come from people who are too busy. If only politicians and scientists were lazier, how much happier we should all be. The lazy man is preserved from the commission of almost all the nastier crimes, and many of the motives which make us sacrifice to toil, the innocent enjoyment of leisure, are among the most ignoble. Pride, avarice, emulation, vainglory, and the appetite for power over others. How then has sloth found a place with its 6 odious companions as one of the mortal sins? Theologians are the least rhetorical of writers. Their vocabulary is elaborate and precise, and when they condemn an act as a mortal sin, they are not merely expressing disapproval in a striking phrase. They mean something specific and appalling, an outrage against the divine order committed with full knowledge and consent which, if unrepented before death, consigns the doer to eternal loss of salvation. Prelates and preachers may be found who use the words irresponsibly. One sometimes sees proclamations in which the faithful are exhorted to vote in an election or refrain from an entertainment under pain of mortal sin. Moral theologians give little support to such utterances. Indeed, many speculate that the sanctions being so awful and the conditions so stringent, very few mortal sins have ever been committed. We only know that hell is there for those who deliberately choose it. Shall we go there for lying too long in the bath or postponing our letters of congratulation or condolence? Obviously not. What then is this sloth which can merit the extremity of divine punishment? St. Thomas's answer is both comforting and surprising. Tristitia di bono spirituale, sadness in the face of spiritual good. Man is made for joy in the love of God, a love which he expresses in service. If he deliberately turns away from that joy, he is denying the purpose of his existence. The malice of sloth lies not merely in the neglect of duty, though that can be a symptom of it, but in the refusal of joy. It is allied to despair. There is a well-known pathological condition of religious melancholy in which the sufferer believes himself to be eternally damned through no particular fault of his own, but by the ineluctable whim of the Almighty. In recent years, with the waning of Calvinist eloquence, this aberration seems to have tended to shed its religious trappings, but there are recognizable traces of it in some of the utterances of the beatniks. Despair of this kind is not sloth. Sloth is the condition in which a man is fully aware of the proper means of his salvation and refuses to take them because the whole apparatus of salvation fills him with tedium and disgust. It is, one might suppose, a rare condition most often found among those who have dedicated themselves to a specifically religious vocation for which they find themselves unworthy, and not the prime temptation of men living in the world. 60 years ago, it would have been pedantic to treat of it in a secular journal, but curiously enough, in this generation, the man of sloth, in all his full theological implications, has become one of the stock figures of stage and novel. The protagonists of these popular spiritual dramas, French, English, American, sometimes priests, are spoken of as having lost their faith, as though faith were an extraneous possession, like an umbrella, which can be inadvertently left behind in a railway carriage. But in fact, their predicament is quite different from that of their unhappy great-grandfathers, who, confronted with plausible arguments that the universe took longer than 6 days in the making, decided that the whole foundation of their religion was spurious. These new apostates do not wrestle with historical and philosophical doubts. They simply lapse into sadness in the face of spiritual good. The plainest representation of this depth of sloth, and the one likely to be freshest in the reader's memory, is Query, the central character of Mr. Graham Greene's recent novel, A Burnt-Out Case. He is an eminent architect who, like the less-known writer Moran, created by the same richly gifted writer, is sickened by the applause of admirers who persist in attributing his achievements to a love of God he has ceased to exercise. Love of his fellow men also dies in him. Eaten by apathy, self-pity, and the sense of futility, he tries to escape to the most remote refuge in Central Africa, where there happens to be a leper settlement. Here he dies a ludicrous death. The only change in him has been a twinge of affection for a servant and, at the instigation of an atheist doctor, an interest in the erection of some new sheds. The author's intention, as in most of his later books, is obscure. Does he mean us to recognize in these feeble stirrings of humanity an act of the will which a theologian would recognize as contrition? We must not impute damnation to a human soul. With fictitious characters, we are free to speculate. I should say that, but I can't say it because I can't turn the frickin' page. I should say that on the facts given us by Mr. Greene, Query was guilty and in hell. He is one of a rather large company of modern fictitious characters. The fact that they have so captivated the artists and the public of the day suggests that the problem is not so recondite as might have been supposed. It must not be thought I am accusing Mr. Greene of sloth. Artists often express vicarious experiences. Most erotic writing is the work of the impotent. It would be impossible for a man who was really guilty of sloth to write about it, for he would be incapable of the intense work required to produce a novel like A Burnt-Out Case. So much for the sloth of the theologian, technically dubbed acedia or acedia. There is no true classical term for this state, not because it was unknown to the ancients, because it was too commonplace to require identification. The last centuries of European paganism before the revelation of Christian joy were sunk deep in acedia. Now that paganism is returning, we see the symptoms again. Can we accuse our listless and torpid contemporaries of sloth in the sense defined above? I think not, because the great majority have been deprived by the state of religious instruction. The phrase spiritual good is totally foreign to them, and they lack the full knowledge of its nature, which is an essential element in the commission of mortal sin. There are, however, very near parallels, especially in those whose calling has a superficial resemblance to monastic life. The armed services, these men accept higher standards of obedience than civilians and are expected on occasions to make greater sacrifices. Browned off and bloody-minded troops present a type of sloth. I have seen soldiers in defeat who could not be accused of laziness. They were making strenuous exertions to get away from the enemy, nor were they impelled by fear. They had simply become bored by the mismanagement of the battle and indifferent to its outcome. There were ill-found camps and stations in the war where men refused to take the actions which would have alleviated their own condition, but instead luxuriated in apathy and resentment. There was a sense of abandonment there which, though it was not recognized as such, was theological in essence. Instead, it found expression in complaints, just or unjust, against the higher command and the politicians. It was suggested above that we were not putting ourselves in danger of hell by indolence, but just as he is a poor soldier whose sole aim is to escape detention, so he is a poor Christian whose sole aim is to escape hell. Besides acedia, there is a pagritia, plain slackness, which is a deflection from, if not an outrage against, the divine order. This increasingly is a national characteristic, so closely allied to our national virtues of magnanimity and good temper as to be at times barely distinguishable from them. It is strange in an age when the conscience is directed so constantly to social aims that this vice so largely escapes censure. For if, as has been said, the personal motives of industry may be base, the consequences of idleness on society are conspicuously deleterious. It is a fault about which we are particularly liable to self-deception. Almost all the men and women in England proclaim themselves to be busy. They have no time to read or cook or take notice of the ceaseless process of spoliation of their island, or even to dress decorously. While in their offices and workshops, they do less and less in quality and quantity for ever larger wages with which to pay larger taxes for services that diminish in quantity and quality. We have voted for a welfare state, but are everywhere frustrated because we are too lazy to man the services, too few school teachers, too few hospital nurses, too few prison wardens. That way lies national disaster, but the subject of this essay is moral, not political. There is something unattractive about those who gaze out of their windows for long periods studying the idleness of the navies at work, or is it navies, outside. Let me speak of my own trade. Since I first set up as a writer nearly 35 years ago, I have witnessed a lamentable decline of power in all the processes of literature. The period between the delivery of a manuscript to the publishers and its appearance for sale as a book is now about 3 times what it was in my youth, as also is the period between ordering a book from a shop in the provinces and receiving it. The standards of printing have deteriorated. Compositors equipped with mechanical devices unknown to their illustrious predecessors are ruthless in setting up gibberish and preserving it against proof corrections. But it ill becomes authors to complain of the mechanics. We are ourselves in a situation peculiarly apt for self-deception, for there is no one except ourselves who can accuse us of idleness. The actual process of writing is laborious and irksome. We sit at our desks for, say, 2 hours and emerge with 1,000 deathless words. But if we sit at our window smoking, observing the birds, who is to say that we are not deep in aesthetic rumination? If we lounge in a foreign cafe, who is to say we are not collecting material, not the commissioners of income tax? You must know us by our works. How many of us display the hard gem-like flame with which, for example, Max Beerbohm in his day illuminated even the columns of the Daily Mail? How many resolve that nothing shall leave the workshop which is not as perfectly finished as our talents allow? How many have simply given up the effort to plan and complete and adorn a work of art endowed with the most splendid language in the world? Most of the young writers seem intent to debase and impoverish it. That's kind of what I'm reading in another book, Trousered Apes, Sick Literature in a Sick Society. Their elders do not set them a high example. If one considers the list of those who 20 years ago would have been expected to be now at the height of their powers, one finds a pitiably small band of survivors, and those mainly men and women of the previous decade. The rest concerned themselves with appearing on television, collaborating in film scripts, and attending congresses where they call attention to the lack of prestige they are accorded. Of the hard, long work of actually writing books, most have despaired. How many reviewers, even in the respectable papers, read the book sent them with close enough attention to retail their plots or arguments without mistakes of pure laziness? It may be noted that in the arts, profusion as much as sterility may be evidence of laziness. Those huge novels from North America are not the product of diligence. Hard labor would refine and clarify them. Some writers, it is said, leave this to their publishers, presenting them with trunkloads of typescript from which a prices, I will guess, is made in the office. There is not a common trouble in this country. Here we suffer rather from the imposture of writers who produce their rough note and sketches as finished work and pretend to a unity in what are mere scraps of articles and lectures. These are some of the evidence of sloth in a single trade in a country where the vice is widely prevalent. They may seem of minor importance in the history of national decline, but they are symptomatic of the whole disease, and literature was formerly the one art in which we could claim equality with, if not superiority to, the rest of the civilized world. Sloth is not such an innocent weakness as at first glance it appeared. It is easy to find explanation of modern laziness. All the glittering prizes of success have lately become tarnished. The company in the room at the top has lost the art of pleasing, but sloth is not primarily the temptation of the young. Medical science has oppressed us with a new huge burden of longevity. It is in that last undesired decade when passion is cold, appetites feeble, curiosity dulled, and experience has begotten cynicism that acedia lies in wait as the final temptation to destruction. That is the time which is given a man to make his soul. For few of us, the heroes and martyrs, privilege of a few clear days ending on the scaffold. Instead, an attenuated, bemused drifting into eternity. Death has not lost its terror in the new clinical Arctic twilight. In this state, we shall have to face the last deadly assault of the devil. It is then, perhaps, that we shall be able to resist only by the spiritual strength we have husbanded in youth. And I probably should not have drunk or partially drunk a 10% beer while reading this book, but there we go, bruv. And we're left with only lust. Oh, wait, we got lust and anger. So we are only at number 5? Don't seem right. It seems like we have 10 deadly sins. No, there's 2 more to go. Lust and anger. All right, lust will be next time. It looks like. All right, Bobs, goodbye. Goodbye.